So, thank you all for being here. I'm Dr. Yana Weinstein. I come here from Boston. And actually, I'm a part of a group of 4 people who you may or may not follow on Twitter. How many of you are on Twitter? Okay, not actually as many as I thought, but if you are, you may follow ACE.test. How many of you follow ACE.test? Just one? Wow, okay, so you're going to make lots of new, I'm going to make lots of new friends. All right, so that's me, and there are actually 4 of us. This is a group that has grown over the past year, and I'll talk to you a little bit about who we are and why we do what we do. But I do have to tell you that today I'm giving 2 talks. This was a very last-minute decision on Tom Bennett's part. You know, can you do not 1, but 2 talks? Okay. So this is part 1. There's going to be an introduction, and I'll tell you a little bit about why this Learning Scientists group started and what we do. And then I will talk to you about planning. We'll see what that is. And then, if you like what you hear, part 2 is not a repetition, it's a continuation. Okay, so that's at 2 p.m. So the first thing I want to talk to you about is, I'm a cognitive psychologist, and what is the point of cognitive psychology as it relates to education? So when I go to a party or I go somewhere where I meet other people, which is not very often, but when I do, I might be asked, "Oh, hello, nice to meet you. What do you do?" And if you ask my students, they might joke, "Oh, she just loves tests. That's what she does. All she does is do tests." And so maybe I just say, "Hi, I love tests." But what I'm more likely to say is, "I apply cognitive psychology to education." And then people look at me like, "Okay, I've heard some words. I think I know what education is. Psychology, maybe cognitive." So what does that actually mean? Well, if I break it down very simply, the goal of the research that I do is to help students to study better. But because I can't reach all that many students all at once, because honestly students are not really interested in coming to talks like this very much, instead I talk to teachers who then hopefully pass along some of that information to their students. So hopefully you will be doing that. Or maybe if you're a research lead in the school, you pass it on to the teachers, who pass it on to the students, etc. So that way we get more and more people. So what is cognitive psychology as it applies to education? Well, here is what we do. It's actually very simple. We take what we already know about cognition. So this is memory, attention, perception, and then we build on this knowledge, decades and decades of research, of basic research, into these processes. And then we develop learning and teaching techniques that are not just random and pulled from the sky and then we try to figure out if they work or not. But they are based on what we already know about the way that our cognition works. So they're much more likely to succeed because we know how these processes work. And so then we build these learning and teaching strategies, and then we test them out to see if they do work, and then we tweak them. And a very important part of this tweaking process is what I call the lab to classroom model, okay? Because we don't jump straight into the classroom. There is this misconception that cognitive psychologists just do everything in the lab, and this is not true, but we do start in the lab. So what I call basic laboratory research involves having participants do very simple tasks with very simple materials, or what we call stimuli, that sometimes can be something like the nonsense syllables that Pedro talked about in his first talk, where Ebbinghaus, 125 years ago or so, had himself learning these very small syllables that no one would learn in real life. Okay, so this is a very fake situation that is not directly relevant to the school situation. And when we find something that works in this very, very controlled laboratory setting with very controlled materials, then it's time to scale up to the next stage, which is applied laboratory research. This is still happening in very controlled settings, but now, instead of these nonsense syllables or maybe just lists of words, the students are studying things that they really would encounter in real life. So maybe it's textbook chapters, maybe it's a video lecture or something like this, okay? And then when we find a strategy that has worked many, many times, not just one time, in both of these levels, then only then will we scale up to the applied classroom research, okay? So this is where we actually go into classrooms with those relevant materials, and then we test out that research with maybe the teachers helping us in some way. And the reason why we wait so long to get to this stage is because this level here is very expensive, both in terms of time of the teachers, of the students, of the researchers, and because of money, and you have to get huge grants to do this. And we wouldn't want to waste the teachers' and students' time with techniques that we just made up and we want to try and see if they throw anything on the wall, right? We want to see what really works under controlled settings and then scale it up. Another important point here is that the sample, the participants that we're collecting, these first 2 times are just the easiest we can find, so they tend to be our own students or psychology students who have to take experiments for credit. Once we get to the classroom level, then we're really looking at the population of interest. So if we're interested in 5th grade, then we go to the 5th grade classroom. If we're actually interested in undergraduate students, then maybe all we have to do is do it in our own classes, which I have done, and then it's easier to scale up. But this is the model. Before I continue with some basic principles from cognitive psychology that are very important to know, I do want to give some disclaimers, and I already started that in that talk, because science is messy, and science is not going to give you absolutes. And some of what I have to say is probably going to be, very much as Pedro said, less impressive and less convincing than someone who stands there and says, this is going to work. So here's how we cannot help you, okay? We cannot predict what grade a student is going to get, because I get asked this sometimes. Okay, so if I use this method within students, do you think it will raise them this many grades or this much percent? I don't know. Depends on a million things. We can't fix all the problems. We can't say, just use all these methods and everything will be okay. That's sometimes what people want to hear, sometimes what other companies say. Well, other companies, we're not companies, period. We cannot guarantee success. There are apparently companies that say that if you follow their methods and do not get an A, they will give you money. Yeah, we don't have any money to give you anyway, but even if we did, we would not be giving it out if you didn't get an A. But what we can do is we can build on what we already know about cognitive psychology and build these strategies. And then another way that we can help, this is very new for us, but that's in one more slide, let me just get to it right away. We can ask you, teachers, what research questions remain, and then we can try to answer them with research. And this is actually not done as often as I would like it to be, but recently with these workshops that we started giving, we're actually finding out from teachers, okay, so what I really want to know is what happens when I do it this way, or I have something that works and I don't know why it works, can you figure it out for me? So just to go backwards a little bit, based on what we find, we can come up with flexible guiding principles, not rules, not laws. There are actually no laws of memory, really, which is an interesting idea, that lots of sciences have laws, but memory doesn't really, or psychology doesn't really. But there are some flexible guiding principles. And another thing that we can do is when we find something that works, we don't just say, this works, everybody do it. We can figure out exactly why it works and which component of it is important and which component can be changed without affecting the main result. Okay. So why this not company at all? We don't know what to call it. We just call it the project because it doesn't have any kind of official status, but we call ourselves the learning scientists. Why do we exist and what are we doing? We're all just cognitive psychologists who have jobs as professors, but we formed this little group. And I'll tell you how it got started because it's really very organic and really pretty random. So one evening, almost exactly 1 year ago, this is all very much based on Twitter. I was sitting on Twitter. I didn't really have any followers, maybe under 100, and I just used it to scroll through the news, okay, and scrolling through the news, and then I was like, I need to do something on Twitter to help society somehow, misguided idea I had. And so I posted this tweet, which is probably not going to make much sense, but I'll explain it. I said, I've decided I'm going to be a vigilante, evidence-based practice for education evangelist on Twitter. So I decided this, and I can tell you 1 year later I am that, so apparently I really meant it. So then I explained, if you have no idea what this means, I said, it means I'm going to look for people tweeting about their schoolwork or their tests, and I'm going to help them study. Okay, these random people who don't know who I am, I'm just going to insert myself into their life and tell them how to study. I really meant it. And then Megan Smith, who had been studying in the same institution as me 5 years ago, we hadn't really kept in touch, really never worked directly together, we just knew each other. She noticed this because she had also started using Twitter for some kind of assignment she was teaching her students, and she said, oh, that's cool, we need to use a hashtag. Like, okay, hashtag. And the hashtag we used for a few minutes was AceThatTest. And then the next day we said, wait, the hashtag is not enough, we need a whole account. So we started this account, AceThatTest. She scribbled a logo. We called ourselves learning scientists, but that's a very long Twitter handle, so we called it ASTAT test. We didn't really think through very much because there was no grand plan. It was just, let's do this thing. Here to help you learn more, not trying to sell you products, because this is our bottom line always. There's nothing that we're selling, it is just science. And what we did, as I said, was that we found people like this person who's saying that she was studying something, and then I asked her a question, how do you study? And she said, I read over my notes, I underline keywords, and I even rewrite them sometimes. And maybe you heard from Pedro that highlighting, underlining is the same, is useless. And so then I said, wow, very interesting. That's a common strategy, but we know from research it's not very effective. So here are some other ideas. And this person actually, so she said thank you, and then a few days later she tweeted again to say that she studied for a long time using the methods we recommended, and then did well in the tests. And this actually happened. It worked pretty well, and we were very excited. I mean, okay, 98% of the people just ignored us, obviously. About maybe 1% said, who the hell are you, get off my timeline? And I'm like, do you understand how Twitter works? If you tweet out in public, I'm allowed to respond to you. And then another 1% actually put this advice into practice and then came back to tell us that it worked. But after a few days of this, we were like, what the hell are we doing, right? So, I mean, this is not really a normal activity for a scientist, right? To be randomly trolling people on Twitter and telling them that they're studying the wrong way. It's not really, I can't put it on my CV, right? I trolled 372 people in the month of January 2016. Please give me a promotion. So luckily, we were saved by a communication expert. This is actually the fiance of Megan Smith, who's also wasting her time tweeting things, but with a little less zealousy as me, because I get kind of obsessed with social media now. She's just like, chill. So he had this idea, and he said, look guys, you can't just tweet. This is not enough. You need some kind of long-form communication. You need a place for people to discuss. You guys should start a blog. And bear in mind, we had no plan. We were very, very busy with our work. This was like a blog. What the hell? Blog? What the hell? I don't know. And so, okay, we wrote a blog. And we wrote this for our first blog post. And we called it Communication Breakdown Between Science and Practice in Education. And the idea is that we're doing all this science, we're doing all this cognitive psychology applied to education, but the actual educators out there, you guys, are not receiving any of this information because it's staying in these narrow journals and not getting out there. And you know, we had this very idealistic, spread the word, it's science, and we thought this was going to be, people were going to say, oh, that's interesting. And actually we got a huge response to this, despite only having been on Twitter maybe a week with our ASTAT test. But unfortunately, there was not full positive response. So there was a lot of criticisms, like, how dare you, you know, be so arrogant, and you think you can just reduce education to scientific principles, and you don't understand. And then we got thrown into the politics of education. Now, we clearly just had no idea. We were totally naive. We thought everybody was just trying to do the best they could. I mean, they are. But what we didn't know was about these debates that are ongoing and very, very contentious about progressive versus traditional education. I had never even heard these labels somehow. We've had people saying to us, what do you mean you want your children to do these strategies that feel bad? You must hate children. Why would you subject them to something that they don't like? Do you even have children? Somebody asked me. I'm like, actually, yes, I have a few, but I don't think it's really relevant. Have you even met a child? Like, you think it's possible that a child is going to be able to like a quiz or something? You know, I mean, they just thought it was absurd, the things that we were saying. Another criticism that we received was, why would you want to do a randomized controlled study? I mean, that's not like real life. Real life isn't controlled. And then this guy was my favorite. He has like 50,000, 500,000, I don't know, Twitter follower, giant. And he says to me, we don't have time for journals, like actual scientific journals and studies. We need right now solutions from real practitioners. I don't know what that means, but it's very apparently inspiring because lots and lots of people were very happy that he said this. Maybe you have more of an idea about what that means. But I think it means that they don't want to hear about the messy science. So, 1 year later, we've moved on a little bit from just the Twitter and the one blog post, and we're now the learning scientists, and there are 4 of us. 2 people joined from around the world. They saw what we were doing, they liked it. They're also cognitive psychologists. And sort of to show you the trajectory of our first year in terms of page views of a blog, I guess, just so you can see how we grew. We started out, we were getting consistently about 10,000 page views a month, and then something happened. And you might ask, what happened? Why was there a jump? And what happened was that we released 6 posters about study strategies, and that's what I'm going to be talking about today, 3 of them at least. And this gave us quite a big boost in terms of readership. And then what happened here was 2 things, actually. We released a podcast and then also a video that summarizes these strategies. So whatever you don't remember from today, you can look back at any of these 3, and actually there's more resources, but we basically tried to synthesize what we know from cognitive psychology and put it in materials that are completely free, that teachers all over the world in different languages as well. We don't have speakers yet though, but we can work on that. Can download and use in their classrooms. And one best piece of advice that we received as we started this blog was be consistent, because so many people just start blogs and then they get excited and they write a bunch of things and then, life happens and then they give up. And so what we do is we have this almost obsessive schedule where we post 3 times a week. And on Tuesday we have a guest post, and this is teachers, students that write for us and describe how they use cognitive psychology in the classroom, for example. And then on Thursday, one of us writes a blog post, and then on Sunday we have a digest of resources. And so this is 3 times a week, and we have a mailing list, and it's growing, and I think people are really liking that consistency. Certainly there are weeks when we're like, oh, another blog. But we've done it, and we only took 1 2-week break over Christmas, and other than that, every single week you'll see these 3 posts. So I recommend maybe signing up to the mailing list if you don't already. There might be some things that are of interest. So what I'm going to be talking about today is 3 of the 6 learning strategies that cognitive psychology is kind of galvanized around. And this is not random. This is not just some catchy thing because there are 6. Okay. What this is decades and decades and decades of research that point to these strategies as being the most effective for learning. Because sadly, in a way sadly, there's not all that much we can say. We can't tell you really 100 important things. And even if there were 100, they wouldn't all be important, right? But these are really the only 6 strategies that receive consistent evidence. And I'm going to talk about this morning just this one, spaced practice. And then this afternoon, I'm going to be talking about 2 more, retrieval practice and dual coding. And you may recognize them, or you should recognize them, because Pedro actually already talked about them. But don't worry, this will be not just repetition, but it will be repetition and enhancement, because you will see some data from research studies, which he did not show, at least not in graph form. So why do we feel the need to describe these strategies? If there's so much research already, doesn't everybody just know them all? And the answer is no. And here's why. Here's the problem. If you look at teacher training textbooks, how many of them do you think cover these principles? You don't have to guess because I have the answer for you in 1 second. So what this project did was they looked at, I think, 48 different teacher training textbooks. I believe they were American, but I think they're going to be quite similar in terms of around the world, I imagine. Maybe not Korea, but who knows. But these were American, possibly also British teacher training textbooks. And they searched for any mention or description or analysis of those 6 strategies. And when they search, I mean, they really look for even if it was just mentioned in 1 sentence, not like a whole chapter. And then here you see how many of the textbooks actually focused on those principles at all. So for example, retrieval practice, which I'll talk about this afternoon, literally 0% of the textbooks, none of them, even mentioned this. I don't mean that they had no chapter on it, they didn't mention it. Meanwhile, all of them had a chapter on learning styles. So, now you think about what's important and what's in the textbooks. Okay, so I'll start now with talking about spaced practice, and I'll give you a little bit of scientific evidence for it. The main idea is one that you probably either already knew before coming here, or you already heard from Pedro, so it's going to be somewhat repetitive, but the basic idea is this. If you have 2 opportunities to study, and you put them next to each other, or you space them out over time, the exact same amount of studying, you're going to have better memory in the long run for the information that you study spaced out. It's a very, very, very simple idea. And it comes from Mr. Dr. Ebbinghaus, who experimented on himself. And he says, with any considerable number of repetitions, a suitable distribution of them over a space of time is decidedly more advantageous than the massing of them with a single time. And really, he did it with many different ways, different numbers, and every single time he found that really just spacing it out is better. And the great thing about spaced practice is that it's been repeated over and over again with all sorts of different situations and all sorts of different materials. So an obvious one is vocabulary learning, fact learning, but then also text passages, so not just facts. Solving problems, because people often say, oh, it's just about memorizing little bits of information. No, it's not. It's also about problem solving, also motor skills, also musical instrument learning. So anything that you need to learn, basically, to do or to know, space it out, and you'll learn more over time. But just saying it is not enough. Let me show you an experiment that describes this, and evidence from the laboratory. So in this experiment, there were 3 conditions. The participants were studying lengthy texts about science, okay? In the single condition, they read the text. Very easy. In the massed condition, they got 2 opportunities to read the text. They read it, and then they read it again. And then in the distributed, they spaced those 2 readings by a week. And then there were also 2 different groups who were tested at 2 different times, okay? So either immediately or in 2 days. And this is going to be a really important thing to consider, because this happens with all the strategies almost, that the results for an immediate test and a delayed test are strikingly different, okay? Because if you look at the immediate test, okay, the single and the massed, in the single they read it once, in the massed they read it twice. So as you would expect, they do better in the massed, okay? They do what? Almost double, okay? So if you have a test coming up in 10 minutes, and you can either read it once or twice, read it twice. But look what happened with the distributed there. No good. If you have a week, and then the test is right away, that distribution didn't help. But what happens if you now, instead of having the immediate test, you have it 2 days later? Here is what happens. You have a very different pattern of results. Now, the twice, the repetition, the single, and then the mass, it was exactly the same. So you wasted your time reading it that second time. Complete waste of time. But if you had just read it once, waited a week and read it again, and then your test is in a couple of days, then that spacing helps. And this is why when teachers say to students, cramming doesn't work, they're like, I crammed and I got an A. Like, I don't know what teachers are talking about. They're just saying this. It's not true. It does work, right? Especially if you're cramming all night long and then you literally just show up to the test and you just read something 10 times. Yeah, sure, you read it, you answer questions, you're done, you're like, okay, I don't even know what was on that test. I have no idea, but it's over. And maybe for some students, sometimes that's all they need to do. If it's really something that is the most useless thing that they're ever going to learn, that they just want to get that certificate. But you know what I tell my students? Like, they don't like this. I'm like, you know you can buy a degree online, right? Like, you don't have to come to class. If the only reason you're here is to get a piece of paper, there's easier ways to do it. That's what I tell them. If you're here trying to learn, you actually probably want to remember some of that information later. So often we'll, have something that is taught in one semester or 1 year, and then the following year we say, oh, so remember this? Oh yeah, you covered it last semester. No idea, okay? So that's what we're trying to avoid with spacing. It's not that cramming never works and you can't learn anything that way. Sure you can, but it exits as quickly as it entered. So how do we teach this? It's really, really difficult to encourage students to do this. So as teachers, we have to try to integrate spacing in the curriculum, but then also try to model the good habit. So the idea, the hope, is that students will sit down and review information from not just the class that they studied. I mean, they probably don't even do that, but if they were to do that, the ideal thing would be for them to go back a week, back a month, and see maybe what they can remember from older classes. One really, really easy way to do this as teachers, if you have control, is just to give homeworks on the previous material instead of homeworks on the material you taught today. and then automatically you have spacing. You could have a homework that has something from today, something from a week ago, something from a month ago. Done, spacing. But if you're not giving out these regular homeworks, and then you're doing it in the class, it's a little difficult. If you're expecting the students to study outside of class, it's even more difficult. And the thing is that it feels difficult. And guess what? Humans don't like things that feel difficult. They like things that feel easy. So students are not going to enjoy sitting there and being like, oh, what did I do a month ago? Oh, I don't know. You know. So you have to help them to kind of go through that bad feeling and encourage them and say, you know, that feeling, that difficulty, that's actually what's helping you learn. So one thing you can do as your students get older and they're getting to the point where they're trying to self-regulate their learning, because sometimes we get this jump from high school to university. I find with my university students, they don't understand this concept of having to structure their own time, their own study time. So one thing you can do is to help students actually to create a study schedule. So if there's some big exams that are coming up, actually concretely sit them down and say, okay, what's reasonable? How much can you study? Don't plan to study 5 hours a day. They're not going to do that. How much are you studying right now? 1 hour a week. Okay, let's try 2. Not let's try 50, okay, because it's unrealistic. And they need to block off the time on the calendar. Don't just say, oh, I'll study this week. It's not going to happen. So after they've done the schedule, and I'll show you an example in a minute, then they should record, okay, did you do what you said you were going to do? No. Okay, why not? So actually have them stay accountable to their plan. And then you could bring them back in class and discuss, okay, so who managed to stick to the schedule? What was it about the schedule that helped or didn't help? What was the reason? Okay, so you said you were going to study an hour on Tuesday night, why didn't you? Oh, I forgot. Okay, so do you need to like set a reminder? Okay, I didn't want to. Okay. I was, you know, too tired. Okay, maybe that's not the ideal time. Maybe it was unrealistic. So discuss these challenges. And then, based on what they say, then you can help them adjust to get to the point where it's realistic and they can actually commit to doing what they said. So sometimes when I speak to 15-year-olds, 16-year-olds, I say, look, put some time in your schedule. You're probably going to do less than it, but put something that's just so small, but you can really promise to commit. Maybe it's 5 minutes, because guess what? 5 minutes is better than 0 minutes. And they're like, oh, okay, they put 30. None of them put 5, because I guess they think like it's silly. But even 5 minutes spaced out, 5 minutes every day, vocabulary practice is amazing. So here's an example with an actual schedule that, you know, the kid might have. So you could help them identify, okay, so if you have a math class, you might want to do some studying for that class, not that same day, but the day later, so that that information is now a little bit forgotten, because that forgetting and then re-studying and relearning is what helps you maintain it in memory. Okay, and then, I don't know why it's the same color, but you could also study French a day later, study science a day later, study history and geography a day later, and then maybe, okay, maths is, maybe you're poor at math, so maybe you block off a longer period of time on Sunday to study math. And then you always say to them, oh, and then on Saturday you can have a day off. And then another thing you could do is, we use these little worksheets for the students, is have them make a plan for what they're going to do and what they're going to study on one side. And then the next week they bring it into class and they honestly record what they actually did. Okay? And then you look on the left and you're like, okay, that's very different. What was on the right? Why was that discussed? And redo the schedule. Okay, so actually this is what I have for part 1. And we have 10 minutes for questions if you want. And then part 2 will be at 2 p.m. if you want.
So I have a question about the spacing. So obviously what you're saying is don't study 2 hours in the afternoon, like study 1 hour in the morning and 1 hour in the evening. But
Ideally longer space than that.
okay. Does it matter what I do in that space? Like, is it better if you say that I do it in the rain?
Sleep.
Sleep. Exercise?
Sleep.
Sleep. Okay.
Sleep is 100%. Exercise, there's some research showing it helps, some research showing it doesn't help, it doesn't matter. Sleep. It's really about memory consolidation. There was a recent article I saw talking about sleep. In sleep, you forget information. I saw it said it detangles your neurons, which is probably massively oversimplified. But it helps you forget, and then you restudy the information, and some of it's forgotten, so then you bring it back. You need to forget a little bit to learn, which is very counterintuitive, but it's that forgetting that actually helps you to then reinforce the knowledge. Because if you don't forget it all, it's too easy, and then you're just doing something really easy. Doing something easy doesn't help. So you need to make it a little bit more difficult, and sleeping will get you there. You just do it morning and evening, you're not likely to forget as much. So evening and morning is actually better than morning and evening, because of when you sleep. Unless you sleep in the daytime. Then morning.
I just wanted to justify napping, so.
Yeah, napping is great, exactly, sure. Study, take a nap, and study again, perfect. Other questions about spacing or cognitive psychology or anything? How many of you here are teachers? And the rest of you, you have to say what you are. Because I don't know what else to ask you. Some people didn't raise their hands, so those who didn't.
I'm a principal. Can you tell me, have you had any thoughts about why, I mean, this has been known, not through science or research perhaps, but most teachers know this, and still we have a school that have massive tests very often and not practicing spacing too much.
Well, I guess I'm not. What do you mean by tests often? That sounds like spacing to me. So.
No, but we have a lot of huge tests and not enough spacing, that's my opinion.
Do you mean like high stakes tests?
Yeah.
Okay. Why do we have high stakes tests? I mean, isn't that more kind of an accountability question in the system, right? So the high stakes don't come from the teachers usually, right? The stakes come from the government or whoever wants to keep tabs on the school. Is that right? Or if the teachers are imposing the tests, I would say they're probably not very high stakes, and then you should come to part 2 to hear about why tests are a great thing. So, I mean, what kind of tests are you talking about? Standardized or?
I thought more of a bigger test at the end of a special. I'm a former science teacher, so if I've been studying science or space or something like that, astronomy, I had to test at the end of this astronomy part of mine.
Well, that in and of itself is not a bad thing. It's just the way that the students are told to prepare for that test that can be problematic. So if you teach everything and then there's like a week and then you say, okay, now learn everything for this big test, that's a problem. But if you say to the students, okay, you have this big test at the end, but what you need to do is constantly review the information throughout each week, and then at the end you won't really need to study, then the test in and of itself is fine, because the test is encouraging them to try to keep that information active throughout the semester instead of just cramming, if it's presented in the right kind of way. Okay? So ideally you would have little quizzes throughout, which I'll talk about in part 2. So, because quizzes actually help you remember information better. And then at the end, you would still have that cumulative test, because if you only quiz the information at the end of each week, then it's just going to be left and forgotten. But if you have that cumulative test in the end, that can encourage students to continue reviewing information from that whole semester. So I don't really think that having these big tests at the end of modules or years is necessarily counter to the idea of spacing. I think what's counter to the idea of spacing is what we call in England revision, or like these cramming sessions at the end of the semester where they say, okay, now go home and learn everything, and then there's a test. I think that's problematic. But the test in and of itself is not the culprit, I would say.
Well, regarding the spacing, is there a mathematical relationship between study 1 and study 2, study 3, and study 4?
If there is, we don't know all the variables that predict it.
Is there also, this is probably our best guess at it?
I mean, our best guess is that you want to do something called expanding retrieval, right? So you might start with a day gap, and then you would go to 3 days and 7 days and some other number of days. But the exact number of days is going to depend on so many variables that trying to worry about those in the classroom setting is just not going to be fruitful, because it's actually going to depend on how quickly you're forgetting. And if you're trying to teach a group of students, you cannot calibrate to everybody's forgetting. So an app can do this, right? So the app will present information to you, and then as you get it right, it will present it less, and then, so the memorization apps like Memrise and Duolingo, I think they have algorithms that are built in that try to approximate this, but teachers don't need to worry about this level of specificity because it's not useful. What's more useful is to do some spacing versus none, which is not done very often. Other questions?
It was very interesting to hear what you said, and these six techniques that you use. I would just like to ask about another aspect which sometimes comes up, and that's the relationship between the teacher and the student is also, I don't know, how do you look at the relationship?
Well, I would say that that's not a cognitive psychology issue, so
No,
you don't look at it.
no.
Not to say that it's not important. And this is actually brings up a very, very important point. Cognitive psychologists are not trying to say all that's important is these, cognitive psychology principles, because there are things like relationships, there's things like hunger. If children come to school and they haven't eaten, none of these strategies are really going to help them all that much, right? So there's some basic kind of needs that need to be taken care of, and I think a relationship is almost one of them. Like if there's no trust between the students and the teacher can tell them, I could stand up here and tell you something, and if you didn't trust me, you wouldn't listen to it, right? So of course it's a very important basis, but I think it's studied more, I guess, as a social psychology issue, maybe in education research, there's certainly research on relationships, but in cognitive psychology takes the mind and takes out the context of other people, which is obviously fairly reductionist, but there are still basic processes that hold true. That makes sense.
I'm also a cognitive psychologist, actually. So I looked at metacognition before. Do you know if there is any what we call like indirect effects of spaced or distributed learning? So the students become more aware of what they know and don't know in this space versus like random.
That's an interesting question. What they know and what they don't know, maybe, but the illusions of learning are very, very strong and very hard to combat. And I'll talk a little in part 2 about that. So the predictions the students make for themselves, if I go back to this, where we have the immediate, what happens when you make predictions about what you're going to remember in the future is that you base it on what would happen if I tested you immediately. Because that's all you can really fathom in your mind right now, because your current feeling of what you know is there, and you can't override it. So what ends up happening is that everybody predicts something like this, even if I say to you, okay, the test is in a day, the test is in a week, the test is in a year. This is what you're going to feel like that you know, so you're going to predict that, and then the actual pattern is going to be this. But even showing students this, having them experience it, when they then do it again and they have, that feeling is just too strong. So it's really, really hard to override metacognitive illusions. That's the short answer. Lots and lots and lots of exposure to it maybe, but it's not enough just to have the students like do it one time and see how it goes, unfortunately.
Sorry, a couple of quick questions. Those tests there, are they all recall tests or are they applied tests?
What do you mean? Oh, okay. So do you mean transfer when you say
So
apply?
yeah, so they're just asking to recall the information that they've read, or are they asking to apply that information?
So it's a very good question. Transfer is the holy grail, the ultimate thing that we want to find in education.
Right.
But, and I hate to break it to you, my personal opinion is that it actually is impossible. Now, hear me out. You're going to say, what do you mean? I think it's not possible to just create transfer by having people learn things. Okay, so what I think that needs to happen for transfer, which I don't really believe, is that they need to practice transferring. So if the task that they were practicing was applying, then the test would be applying and they could do it. But if the practice is reading and trying to memorize a passage, it doesn't really make sense to have an application test because they're going to completely fail it. So in the cases I've showed you, the test was just retrieval, remembering from memory. But there are other situations that promote transfer better, but that really depends on the learning phase. So then you would space out transfer problems, but there's no spacing out learning of facts is not going to help with transfer because you need to practice the transfer.
Okay. And the other quick question was, do you have, for the age of the students in front of you, an optimum amount of spacing? in terms of their?
I think
achievement?
same question again, because it's going to vary so much by individual levels. It's about how quickly they're forgetting. So you could have different levels of forgetting happening within one age group, and there's just no way to make it optimal.
Okay, that's great. Thank you.
Yep, perfect. Thank you.